Greetings, future fossils. Welcome back to another episode of the podcast that explores our place in time. And who better to ask these questions about the unique significance and historical resonance of the moment through which we are all stumbling than mythographer, mystic, poet, historian William Irwin Thompson, one of my favorite minds alive today, someone whose sweeping synthesis of ideas pioneered a new mode of stand-up performance philosophy he calls Wissenkunst, or knowledge art. This guy is extraordinary. His doctoral thesis is still in print over 40 years later, The Imagination of an Insurrection, which is about the Irish Revolution of 1917. He taught at Cornell, he taught at MIT before leaving academia, where he felt, he said, like an atheist at the Vatican, and forged a new counterfoil institution, a post-academic intellectual concert called the Lindisfarne Association, whose roster reads like a veritable who's who of influential latter 20th century thinkers. His most recent book, Thinking Together at the Edge of History, looks back on 40 years of Lindisfarne, reflects on his successes, his trials, his relative failures, at least self-perceived. And it's a beautiful work, like all of his books are. I was lucky enough to interview him twice already before I even started this podcast, and I'll link to those interviews in the show notes, or you can find them on my YouTube channel. But this one is a really different conversation qualitatively. It's much more personal in many respects than the first two, and it's a really beautiful contemplation piece for any of us who are curious about how we can found and carry forward those vital institutions into our increasingly metamorphic age. But before we get started with this special two-part episode, I just want to take a moment to thank some new people who are contributing as patrons to the Patreon subscription option for this podcast at patreon.com/Michael Garfield. Sylvain, Catherine Marie, Anthony DeBiasio, and Brandon Simmons. Thank you all so much for throwing down on this. It makes a huge difference in my ability to edge out of other less satisfying or helpful hustles and edge deeper into my work, my calling as a midwife to new myths, and my efforts to help rewild the so-called singularity. Again, if you want to help this show out, you can sign up at patreon.com/Michael Garfield, or you can just search for Future Fossils Podcast on Patreon, and there you will find an extensive archive of not just patrons only, but also free and public recordings, music, talks, writing, all sorts of cool stuff that I will love to give you if you're not already acquainted with it. Just published the Moogfest workshop that I taught for you tech geeks out there. The talk was live looping as applied techno-shamanism. So if you're interested in music or in music technology or just in the occult and esoteric dimensions of performance, I think you will appreciate that. Also, those of you who have subscribed, rated, and or reviewed the show on iTunes, thank you so very much. It's really important to me that we get this podcast into the ears of the people who will appreciate it, all of them, if possible. And the best way to do that is to increase our ranking in the bizarre, arcane, mysterious algorithms that determine how this podcast is served into the feed of those friends to be. So if you are broke but would still like to help the show, then please go over and give a 5-star review to Future Fossils for being among what seems to be a rather scant offering of podcasts, trying to help people take the long-term view and think about how we can be better ancestors. Anyway, thank you all so much for listening. I really appreciate it. Feel free to join our Facebook discussion group, the Future Fossils group on Facebook, or just reach out at futurefossilspodcast@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. Always taking recommendations for new guests or new topics to consider for the show. Love you so much. Thank you. And here we go into our wonderful two-part conversation with William Irwin Thompson. Hi, how are you?
Pretty good. Good morning. Your photograph on Skype is much darker than you are now. You have lost your suntan.
Oh yeah, and the Google Glass has been in the closet for a few years.
Yeah, things like Google Glass and Kindle books, I think, are gimmicky things that come and go, like wire recorders or floppy disks or things like that.
Yeah, I think so. I've been paying attention to. I've actually had this. This is not what I wanted to talk with you about today, but I do find it fascinating. There's a this company Magic Leap, and they're trying to do away with the screen entirely and project an image directly into your eye.
No thanks.
Yeah, I was like, you combine that with, like, Radiolab just put out an episode on using artificial intelligence for conversational synthesis to, like, fake human voices of specific people, and what they call facial reenactment, which is like copy and paste your facial expression onto the video of another person. And so
it's emojis gone wild, yeah.
Totally. And also it's sort of the end of the recording as admissible evidence. So it's really confusing to me how we're going to make it as a society in that where we can't agree. It's like bad enough, the Cambridge Analytica stuff. I don't know.
Well, if you look at, like, the rise and fall of the Maya and collapse, they, deforested because they were into pyramids, and they were so addicted to having a zillion pyramids that they completely destroyed their environment. So it's a characteristic of bacteria and human beings to, exhaust their ecotone.
Gosh. So how are you?
I'm fine, hanging in there entering my 80th year, and still, well, I pretty much, in terms of writing, I think I've completed my career. I don't feel, a strong compulsion to research or write a new book. I think with 24 books, I've said what I have to say, and I think it's oftentimes with authors an exercise in egocentric vanity that they feel they don't exist unless they're admired and reviewed, the Norman Mailer syndrome. And I don't want to do that to my readers and inflict stuff that's not anything but a gesture of, egocentric gratification. So I think I'm done there, and it's good to know when you are done. And I think the millennials, you can help me out on this, are a different breed, a different generation. I don't think I know how to talk to them or share their philosophic worldview. And maybe even philosophic worldview is a gesture of my generation than theirs. So I write poetry all the time, but I don't do essays or big research projects. So that coming into being sort of wrapped it up for me.
Yeah, I noticed that you called Thinking Together at the Edge of History your last book in the book.
Yeah.
And I was like,
yeah,
it's kind of poignant. I was like, well, okay, now there's it's been delimited. I'm capable of reading everything that you've written. I'm not there yet, but I'm getting closer.
Yeah. Well, generally it's the act of death that creates a closure that allows a writer to be absorbed and really begins to live in the culture posthumously. And so now with this complex virtual reality and multiple realities that you describe, or were describing, one can, do that earlier and still survive one's own erasure, to use a Derridian kind of concept. So I'm, I guess you would say moving into the spiritual zone that is not defined by doing, but more being. And so there isn't the compulsion to say, hey, notice me, review me, I'm here. And pretty much in my career, I've sort of noticed that it was like a cocktail party where you go in to the room and everybody is looking over your shoulder at the entrance to see if a celebrity just walked in, and they're not really making eye contact with you. And so it's always been difficult to get the attention of the culture and get, books reviewed. I don't know if even Coming Into Being was reviewed by the New York Times. Certainly the memoir of Lindisfarne was not. That was a small press activity, and there wasn't, general interest of the mainstream culture. So one has to, accept that and not fight it and say, hey, look at me, respond.
Yeah. Well, for what it's worth, I do think that, there's throughout your work, you repeatedly refer to the stuff that you and the other members or the other Lindisfarne fellows accomplished as sort of a crocus heralding spring.
Yeah.
The first flower, and then it snows and it's buried. And I think that's really that's also contained in your curious decision to name this group and this project after a sort of doomed, this early Christian group that was, as I understand it, unable to maintain in the face of a Viking invasion. And
yeah, no, it got wiped out by the Vikings in 793. But, Aidan founded it in 635. So from 635 to, hence, my address on Skype, to 793 is a goodly length of time. And by that time, it had Christianized England, and so Celtic Christianity and Augustinian Christianity coming from Rome sort of met in the heart of England, and so the transformation was affected as a shift from what you might say the Dark Age to the medieval period. So it wasn't a failure, but it was a time-bound event, a concert of ideas, as I use the phrase in the Lindisfarne memoir. So that's not bad. That most instances, Bauhaus, lasted even, I think, a shorter time, and it was highly influential in the Chicago School of Architecture and things like that.
It's funny, I was reading Thinking Together at the Edge of History in sort of loose parallel. Actually, I was going back through your bibliography and reading passages about Earth at the same time, and in there you mention this collapse of cultural authority and political power in the United States. And it's interesting to me how Lindisfarne seems to have performed in sort of a counterpoint to that you say in passages about Earth that it's sort of a uniquely American problem that we can't even tell the difference between power and authority. And it feels like this notion of writing, the way that you described it in that book was, that once upon a time, the academics were sort of laughed out of DC, but that they were still able to go back to Cambridge and set their works in motion that would influence the culture in the years to come, and that those two things were still possible. And I'm curious to know whether it's been over 40 years since that book came out, and I'm curious to know, looking back over the work of Lindisfarne, if you feel that this group managed that or or where the sort of like created discovered line is with respect to being ahead of your time and sort of receiving a prescient echo of something that will be, versus actually like laying the seeds and the foundation for that thing to come?
Well, I think one has to take the second book as a kind of diptych with passages. At the Edge of History, which was highly reviewed in rave reviews in the New York Times, performed the trope of the individual and the civilization and the switchback trail as I climb up to go to the monastery at the top, and then I use the metaphor when you come to the edge, it looks like you can just touch it, and then the switchback goes in the opposite direction. So in Edge, which performed the shift from, say, industrial to post-industrial or ecological, whatever you want to call it, I played with that idea, and Jerry Brown was one of the few politicians who was kind of interested, and I sort of met with him, and I was too much of a purist. I was actually invited by Nelson Rockefeller to serve on his presidential brain trust commission to run for the president, and I wanted to have authority with Lindisfarne and no power. So I said no, and I said no to all the political elites in Manhattan. And that probably was a mistake. I probably should have been more engagé and accepted it and made a committee on the environment and the ecological movement and had all the Lindisfarne fellows like John Todd and the scientists of ecology and David Orr serve on that committee and bring them to the attention of, the political elite. But, Nelson was a Republican, and as I explained when his brother asked me to serve, Lawrence Rockefeller, that I'm a Democrat, I'm a lefty, I'm not, part of that. But what happened with Clinton is there was this massive political shift in America, affected by Tony Blair in England and Clinton in America, when the Democratic Liberal Party, with its paradigm from FDR and the New Deal, shifted to the right. And the Democratic Party became what were Rockefeller Republicans. And when that happened, the wingnuts, the crazies, on the right wing took over the Republican Party, and they became these kind of nativists who've, entrenched themselves with Trump. And they like Trump simply because he's not part of the liberal elite establishment of Ivy League educated journalists for The Nation or, the New York Times, and professors and the best and the brightest of JFK, and have come in with this lumpen proletariat, know-nothing, aggressive ignorance that's just consummately expressed with Trump. So, all this stuff that we explored back in the 70s, here we are in, nativistic industrialism. And as I said on my Facebook page today, Trump's trying to energize the coal industry and, in the face of climate change, denying and then spewing out all this stuff. I mean, how benighted can we become? But, this is what's happened. And all of that movement of the 60s and 70s has just been, flushed away. I mean, you live in Texas. Austin, of course, is an air bubble in the Titanic and is, always described as the most civilized, intellectually developed part of Texas. But around you, if you go drive in your car, you know what's out there. And I lived in Colorado in extreme rural circumstance, so I know what the Southwest is like. And it's pretty bad.
Well, yeah, I think an air bubble in the Titanic's an interesting way to put it. I would classify myself as deeply ambivalent about most things. And like one of those things is, I think when I first interviewed you back in, it was 2011, I was writing at the time for a blog for this guy, Parag Khanna, who wrote a book recently called Connectography. And it's basically a work of apologetics for technocratic global managerial paradigm, but it's done in such a like thoughtful and sexy way. And and he comes out on, one of the pieces adapted from that book was an essay called "Here Are the 5 Maps the Next President of the United States Needs to Understand," and it was all about the industrial and post-industrial interrelationship between all of the countries in North America specifically, that like you can't build a wall in this world. And so, there's that part of it. There's that sense of, to borrow like a Rudolf Steiner, like Lucifer Ahriman axis, that I see the goal, like I acknowledge the value of that project of like attempting to honor this rhetoric of progress and the betterment of the human condition through this technological solutionism, but it's obviously short-sighted. And then at the other side of it, I sympathize with all of these future-shocked rural people who have every reason to adopt a sort of epical or millennial attitude about things and want that charismatic strongman to come in and help them. And yet you look at somebody like Trump, and it's so clearly and obviously exactly what you were describing, of this collapse in the public imagination between political power and the charismatic. Yeah. It's just, how do we?
Yeah. Yeah, well, that, again, I hate to be the old grumpy geezer saying I told you so, but, the essay in At the Edge of History called The Millennium Under New Management explores that commission on the year 2000 as an appropriation of the millennial as a visionary horizon, and it becomes co-opted by the Davos corporate elite. The book you described could be a lecture for Davos. It sounds exactly what they would do in, their summer resort in the town that is actually the town that Thomas Mann used for his Magic Mountain. So there is this corporate process of appropriation. And as a purist, I was always afraid of that. And so my only way of relating it was to kind of like cross my legs and try to maintain my virginity and say no, And that doesn't work either, To have a child, you have to get fucked. So, it's you have to engage. And I never found, I kept using the Taoist kind of, way inactivity as a form of activity to try to affect cultural change. And, to be fair, a lot of the ideas we were promoting in the 70s are a part of the culture as green values and the way in which everything is advertised as, green and ecologically responsible and stuff like that. So that's the change in the public consciousness that certainly wasn't there in the period of industrial development of America, where they just spewed the crap into the air and into the water and just said this is jobs and progress.
So the main reason that I wanted to get you on the podcast, now that I have like a formal vehicle for conversation, is that this show is really devoted to this intergenerational wisdom transfer and looking forward as, if you want to adopt, and I think it's wise to do so, this sort of monasterial attitude, or rather like a monastic disposition to the management of our cultural inheritance in the face of all of this decay and turbulence. That my hope, and recently I've been like, well, if AI starts forging all of our recordings and we lose the ability to determine which our artifacts are authentic artifacts of the past and which have been hoaxed by machines for God knows what reason, then maybe the point of this podcast is sort of like lost in the noise. But like,
well, the the scary thing is compression, because, if acoustically you listen to a Stradivarius, you have a wide range of tone and subtlety and complexity. But when it's digitalized, it gets compressed, and there's just a lot of stuff that is eliminated from human experience. So you can use that as a metaphor for politics and human relationships, sexuality. I always have this imaginary cartoon for the New Yorker in which the two couples are in bed with their smartphones, and the guy is texting her, "Was that good for you?" and she's texting back, 6 out of 10 or something. So that. And as I walk the streets in Portland, everybody's looking at their smartphone, and thumbing and texting, and they're not looking around. So, the kind of disassociation of the sensibility, to use T.S. Eliot's phrase, has been implemented much more strongly by these new technologies than, 40 years ago when I was, imagining, the direction in which we were going.
So there's no way that this project can really be anything more than giving the future generations a straw through which to sip history, but nonetheless, I don't see, other than like the Long Now Foundation, I don't see a lot of, or like the Wayback Machine and the Archive Project Online, which, they hosted all of the E.F. Schumacher talks and the Lindisfarne tapes, and I'm deeply indebted to them for that. So, but I don't see that many people that are really working on like archival and this preemptive cultural storage and transfer. And so that's what this is. And because of that, I feel like the work that you did and that all the Lindisfarne Fellows did is sort of this. If the Noetic Polity itself were an unsung hero, like if we can regard it as an individual, within this new age in which we are bound to form ever more bizarre and intimate meta-personal associations, like that this group of people as a phenomenon, as an entity in history, is so important. And reading your book, it was really this sort of poignant experience, because you were so candid about the lessons that you learned along the way, and the advice that you have for people who are trying to organize future intellectual consorts and counterfoil institutions. And that's really it, is that I really, after, reading all of these like soaring intellectual treatises and works of history, and really appreciating your voice as a performer of knowledge art, that this book felt so much more deeply personal, to hear your stories of childhood and about, homeschooling your kids. And like, this is that human part of it, the funding of Lindisfarne, and how you felt like you might have managed to carry the project farther had you swallowed the bitter pill, like you were saying earlier, and gotten more politically involved. And so that's the space that I want to hold for this, is to appreciate this work and hope that this interview turns more people on to what you were doing and the influence that you had and all of these people had in our culture.
Well, when you get to be my age, you look back and you think, well, on that bifurcation fork in the road, I went that way, and what if I went the other way? And so you kind of, you're not yet in Bardo and dead, but you're sort of in a Bardo where you're reflecting on your incarnation and thinking of all of those things. And I would say that there's always a kind of quality of a horizon that every youthful generation. We had Gregory Bateson and James Lovelock and those kind of elders of the tribe as our horizon at Lindisfarne. I founded Lindisfarne in my 30s. I went through academia very fast. I was a full professor at 34, and so I had played and finessed the game at MIT, and then when I went to Canada to get away from the Maoist takeover of my department in the 60s, there were all these suburban Berkeley radicals who thought Mao was, a folk hero and didn't realize he was a genocidal maniac. So I said, the hell with this, and quit and went to Canada as a way of getting out of being part of that thought police of the industrial, military state. And there was no Lindisfarne option at MIT because it was either Chomsky or Ithiel de Sola-Pool, an apologist for the Vietnam War, and you either had to be on the flight shuttle to Washington to, tell them how to, run the Vietnam War and the American Empire, or you were part of the extreme left with Chomsky, who was very strident, and there was no third way of spirituality and everything that Lindisfarne energized. So when I was in Canada, I heard the charismatic Ivan Illich, who had written these books and articles for the New York Review of Books in the 60s that became his book, Deschooling Society. And he was the one that articulated the counterfoil institution. But ironically, his own counterfoil institution that was called CDOC, Center for Intercultural Documentation in Cuernavaca, Mexico, really didn't do much and had very little effect on the culture. I would say that Lindisfarne had twice the effect that Illich had, but it was the first time I had come across this idea of the individual as institution and actually breaking loose. So I decided to travel around the world looking, at first Soleri's Arco Santi, and then I went to Germany and talked with von Weizsäcker at his center, and went to Oroville and looked at, the Indian spiritual utopian community, and then came back and set up Lindisfarne in New York. So the counterfoil institution is a fractal. It's, to use Ted Rojak's phrase, person-planet. It's the individual and the group. It's kind of like Bauhaus with all the talented architects and philosophers and painters like Paul Klee. And it had an effect, but it was very short-lived. So I argued in passages that these entities were not institutions but enzymes. They affected a kind of molecular bonding and affected larger institutions, but they themselves weren't meant to become institutions. And so Lindisfarne, which was a temporary phenomenon of Celtic Christianity, getting absorbed by Roman Christianity, was my metaphor for this transformation. And, I had a mystic say that this was all karma because I was St. Cuthbert in my last life and had been part of Lindisfarne and was on the committee, interfacing with Celtic Christianity at the Synod of Whitby with Roman Christianity. And so, one can take that as a kind of imaginative trope. I certainly wouldn't take it literally. But that was what one mystic in the New Age said. So I think these individual institutions have had an effect on, Evergreen State University or, Bard College or Oberlin, which has an environmental studies program with our Lindisfarne fellow, David Orr. So it has not been entirely an exercise in necessary futility, which is a phrase that Baker Roshi used when I brought the Lindisfarne Fellows to meet with the big Rockefeller Foundation, and we were on the top of Rockefeller Center in this kind of boardroom set up with all these, mucky mucks who were giving out the millions. And Gregory Bateson was there, and we couldn't breach the dialogue between industrial and ecological. They just didn't get it. And so as we're going down the elevator, Gregory, who is 6'6" and a big, heavy-set guy too, he leaned against the wall of the elevator and said, and Baker Roshi was smiling it with a sort of Zen humor, said, well, that was a necessary exercise in futility. And so, maybe these sapiental circles, which is Margaret Mead's phrase for these phenomena, maybe that's what they're, supposed to do. When, who was it that said there was the writer in England who said a writer doesn't like to see his ox turned into Bovril, and so when a movie is made of his novel. And when you're the intellectual getting digested and absorbed, it can either be thrilling because you really want to become famous and you want to become a public intellectual and you want to, name drop and be part of the power group. They love it. But if you're trying to energize cultural authority, then it's difficult in America. You can get away with it, I think, more successfully in Europe, where there is this tradition of gray eminences. And in Paris, once you've done something of value as an intellectual, then you're part of it for your life. It isn't like, what are you doing next? Do it again, do it again, do it again. So American culture, based on this kind of hucksterism and boomerism and success culture, is very resistant to that sensibility. So it really was a very European sensibility that I was energizing. And these particular concerts of ideas, which were tremendously exciting, the Lindisfarne conferences. And I kept it going for 40 years. The last conference, we started in 1972 and we ended in 2012. So that's a 2 generations, a good hunk of time. Did you come out of the University of Texas subculture?
No, I came out of the University of Kansas, where we would have birthday parties for Charles Darwin every year in the Natural History Museum. It was a very similar, you talk about like the air bubble in the Titanic. It was a small island of rampant evolutionists.
Did you ever visit Wes Jackson's Land Institute in Salina, Kansas?
I've driven past it, but I never actually, I didn't really come to appreciate its significance until I was already acquainted with your work. The same goes for, I found coming into being in 2009 while I was living in Phoenix, the same time I discovered Arco Santi. So it was just like there was around, I guess I was 25. So like around that time, all of this stuff suddenly became interesting to me, and I only later learned that all of these different factors were swirling together in those intellectual concerts that you talk about, like all of these people that suddenly became interesting all at once. It was like I reached the age of sensitivity to that stuff. But
I think every generation has these things that we hear about later. There was Trabuco College in Santa Barbara with Gerald Hurd, and then Michael Murphy in the 60s founded Esalen, and that was, very influential. And, if you go back into 20s or 30s, and there were always, these small groups, like Miles Davis and the Birth of the Cool in the 50s. And we're always a minority, if we look at the Enlightenment, we're talking about, 12 intellectuals in all of Europe, And and I use that metaphor, I think, in one of my books, where if you were an extraterrestrial and you flying saucered into Florence in the 15th century and said, "Hey, I hear you guys are having a Renaissance." And they said, "What? What do three painters mean? It's still the Middle Ages for them." And so everybody's in, different times, laminar flow. Some are faster and more ultraviolet and high energy, and others are very wide, slow, and sluggish, and that's just, how nature works.
That's very similar to an interview I read with science fiction author William Gibson yesterday.
Oh yeah,
in which he's famous for coining the term cyberspace, but also he's frequently quoted as saying, "The future is already here; it's just distributed unevenly." And, and in this latest interview, he was being asked about dystopia, and he said, there's so many places around the world that, like, basically most first world dystopian fiction isn't about the future. It's about a future in which America looks like the global South. Like this, so the dystopia is here. It's just distributed unevenly, and that's been very keen on my mind lately. This book showed up for me at a time when I've been in like a sort of apex, or what I hope is an apex, of this sort of difficult moral deliberation about where I belong, because I didn't have this exact same trajectory as you, where I managed to, fully ride the rail and excel through my entire academic prospect. Like this. I saw the professorial gig at the end of this rainbow, and then at some point I derailed. Yeah. And it's been. I realized this year that it has been, for my entire adult life, that I have been sort of walking around with an open wound of this, wanting this fellowship that I have mistakenly associated with academic institutional affiliation, and seeking it out in the festival culture, where, like you talk about a lot of a lot of these communal living groups in the 60s and 70s is like rabidly anti-intellectual, and only now finally swinging back around, so that festivals that I'm interested in these days now at least actually have really robust and intelligent speaker series. But it's a rarity still. So it's not an academic world, and it's not in the festival world. And even though those two things seem like they're sort of growing into one another through the lubricating medium of the conference, it's a very living question for me, and for so many people I know, how in an age of, this, like you were describing, and also David Byrne described recently in an essay where he was talking about it seems that the primary function of the internet is to make human interaction unnecessary. So
Skyping instead of you flying up here to interview me.
Oh, yeah. Actually, last time I was in New York, Mitch Mignano and I almost paid you a visit, but,
New York is still a long way from Portland.
It's a shorter drive than Austin to New York. But
That's true.
So this issue of a sort of almost like wandering Jewish kind of quality, it's like you've cast this era in light of the sort of fall of early Celtic Christianity, and the entrance into this dark age, which makes a lot of sense for me, but I resonate more or less equally with, and you gave a really excellent talk about this that's in the Lindisfarne tapes, about Exodus, and about, wandering in the desert, like waiting for the next structure to emerge, and having to be, it being sort of like a lesson or a test in faith. And this question of like, is it wise at this point? Like, if you want to exert influence in the world, if you want to like contribute and make a difference as a young person, does it make sense to try and like wiggle into one of these enormous corporations that are now sort of like stretching to include these innovation labs inside of them? And it's like, I'm a little too smart to know that I won't be like appropriated, that I won't just be like digested and like made into a product if I do that. And I think that this is the issue for so many of us at this time, is like how to maintain integrity and yet still find that sense of like actual living community with human beings that you're in the same room with and that you're involved in that same vision and project with. And it's a mess these days.
Yeah, well, I think each person makes his own dance in response to, the laws of gravity, that, if we didn't have gravity, we wouldn't have ballet, as I think I said somewhere. And so Lindisfarne was a way of trying to create a different quality rather than the academic lecture. I found, just because I'm an Irishman with the gift of gab, that I could turn being an intellectual into what I call a stand-up intellectual. I would, have an audience of 2,000 people, and I would just stand at the edge of the stage and get away from the podium, and I would, talk for 50 minutes without notes. And so it was a concert of ideas, and then I began stumbling on this genre that I call Wissenskunst, which you correctly translated as knowledge art. And I organized other people that I met in my travels. And so the Lindisfarne conferences, E.F. Schumacher was like a rock star. And so we had a group of maybe 90 people in the audience, and then these talks, not lectures, for a conference that became really, as I said, a concert of ideas. So the elders like Gregory Bateson and James Lovelock, Lynn Margulis, they became our intellectual horizon of the wisdom of the elders, the elders of the tribe. And I was not of their generation. I was in my 30s, and Bateson was, I don't know, in his 70s, or late 60s maybe, in 73 or 4. And so I think that's, pretty characteristic. And so people like Mitch Mignano came to Lindisfarne, and he was, a younger, person with a different, sensibility, but he, listened and participated and hung out with us for a while. And so I think that's just, how it goes. And now, because of the complexity of the interpenetrating of cultures of Europe and, Latin America and Asia and the rest of it, there's a lot of creative possibility. You can do a kind of fusion jazz by, drawing off many different elements instead of just the European intellectual, the Enlightenment culture of Europe. And I think that's, all to the good. What happens often, as with fascism and Nazi Germany and Mussolini in Italy, is the paradigm shift is preceded by a nativistic movement, a reaction that tries to hold on to the values that are actually disappearing, like, in the entrepreneur, the culture of greed and money, everything that Trump crystallizes and consolidates. But I don't think, that's going to last. I think actually, as I predicted, Trump will be, removed in 2018 by the Republicans themselves, because he's threatening the Republican Party. He could ruin it for a whole generation. And we've had a generation of liberalism from FDR to, Kennedy and Carter and on. And so this reaction against that, this individualism of the libertarian ideal of no government, that government is best which governs least. That's nonsense when you've got a complex technological society with nuclear weapons. We're not living in farms anymore, so that's got no future whatsoever. And the tough part of the Republicans is they only have negation. They don't actually have a coherent philosophy of governance. They just say no taxes, no laws, no regulation, no environmental protection agency, no. But you can't actually create a civilization or a culture and live on that So it's up to your generation to look at this and come up with a synthesis, maybe of opposites, an enantodromia, and create, the oxymoronic state of, government and rugged individualism.
There's, at the end of Thinking Together at the Edge of History, you make a mention about the transition of money from a liquid state to a gaseous state. And I was really touched by this because I've been tracking, in keeping with what you just said, I've been tracking the sociocultural landing of cryptocurrencies into and like the
Bitcoin,
way the way that all of this stuff is like Ethereum, the cryptocurrency that's like allows people to create smart contracts. So it's not just a money source, but it's a distributed ledger that allows people to make any kind of social agreement, and then it's on the record on everyone who's hosting a node in the network. And so you can do marriages on this, you could do voting on this. And they actually use in the language for Ethereum, it's already ethereal. And then they talk about the computer power used to execute a transaction on a smart contract as gas. So they're like the language is there, like it's like this stuff is being expressed through the zeitgeist in this way. And meanwhile, this is the year that universal basic income has really become a major conversational point again in the American public. And you've got people like Doug Rushkoff writing an op-ed in the LA Times suggesting that universal basic income is actually a self-serving maneuver on the part of Silicon tech billionaires like Mark Zuckerberg. And even it was like Linda Rothschild a couple years ago gave a talk at Davos saying basically we need to give people a basic income if we're going to completely dominate this game, or it's not fun for anyone anymore and we lose our consumer base. And so it seems like we're getting to this point where two kind of major things are happening. I'm curious to know how what your thoughts are on these things, especially in relationship to this issue of, funding the institution, and like what it means to actually, generate a sustainable organization. To actually, I've been a part of so many like premature visionary projects in even my short life so far.
Yeah.
That just failed because they didn't have the thing.
Yeah, no, I discovered, when I set up Lindisfarne as a kind of counterfoil institution, that I became, basically a salesman and had to, make my pitch like a Hollywood, director making his pitch to get a producer for his film. And to keep it alive for 40 years, I had developed all these new skills of, over the years, raising millions of dollars. And so if you're running a college or a dance troupe or an orchestra or anything, someone in the group has to learn how to deal with money. And I think I failed, even though I succeeded in raising millions, by being a 60s kind of countercultural type who was suspicious of money. It was this, as I said, my virginity. I crossed my legs and was afraid of violation. And I didn't really come fully to understand the importance of money. But now that we all bank online, what is this kind of electronic blur? But suddenly somebody wires you money, once a month on your payroll, and it ends up in your bank, and it never was, gold and Fort Knox, solid. It was never fluid currency that somebody actually paid you. It wasn't even, Gutenberg paper where you had a paycheck that you took to the bank. It was suddenly this just electronic signal blurp, and suddenly you've got money in the bank and you can, eat and pay your rent or whatever. And I think anyone who's dealing with culture and arts and creativity, somebody in the group has to understand, money and what it's going to become. And certainly to keep the game going, if constantly we're shifting into AI and robotics, and making people redundant and, having ATM machines instead of bank tellers, and now they say teachers can be replaced by interactive computers that are more sensitive to your level if you're trying to learn, French, then instead of la plume de matant with some, teacher at the classroom, you have a computer that instantly understands your level and begins to work with it by giving you triggered words back. What are we going to do with people? And we got a lot of them. And so a guaranteed annual income is just necessary so the economy can survive, and the billionaires you talk about, the Zuckerbergs and so forth, can still have their game. And so the guaranteed annual income is something I've discussed as well as Rushkoff. I've met Rushkoff. He's a very smart guy, and I think that has to be, the medium is the message, as McLuhan said. So we have to understand money more effectively. So when I set up Lindisfarne, I thought I was energizing a vision or an idea. And what I became in reality was a routine operational manager raising millions of dollars from, Rockefellers and foundations in New York and stuff like that. And what I didn't understand was how to generate wealth. If one could have a product, like you had a musical rock band that, and you had concerts and you made money that way, that the group has to somehow, not just survive on one person's ability to raise money. So everybody in the community was dependent on Bill to keep the party going, and they didn't generate any of the, the money that it took to keep it going. So I failed to really understand, money. And now we're in an economy where money is, a gas, or, even more ethereal than that. It's no longer on the physical plane, to follow up on your metaphor of the etheric plane. And that value is kind of generated by charisma, to speak kind of Rudolf Steiner mystically. Great souls kind of make waves in the ether, and even when they're dead, there is this kind of lingering force field in the etheric that is the traces of Yeats or James Joyce or anybody, a Beethoven or whatever. They leave this kind of lingering trace, and that has energy and value. It becomes part of the extended body of the civilization. It's a subtle body of us that the individual appropriates. The 5 sheaths of yoga that are classic in Kundalini yoga. So we'll see how your generation and the younger ones coming up relate to it. It might come to a crash as the haves and haves not get so grossly caricatured in this Victorian way with Trump. Trump in a way is flushing out the tanks. I mean, he is just so, utterly repulsive that we can't, you can't really have a culture like that. A few rich individuals may, love him because he's not a intellectual elite as it was defined in the JFK Best and Brightest era. So they think this lumpen proletariat ethos is, the way to go. But that's reactionary, and the reactions don't, last forever.
There's that, in reading about your difficulties with the fundraising aspect of Lindisfarne that you just discussed, you made a point in thinking together about how there was like this puzzle to it, which was that people want to meet the charismatic figurehead of the organization, that's what allows the money to flow through. And yet the act of fundraising is itself, like you said, this routine operational process. So like we're back to that confusion in American culture between the charismatic and the routine and the authoritative and the powerful. And it is sort of reflected in the way that you see these boom and bust cycles occurring in like highly volatile cryptocurrency market, where it is literally like the value of this thing, because it's no longer controlled by a central agency, is deeply and totally subject to hype. And so you get to watch it in a much faster, like a much smaller time horizon, a shorter horizon, where that's how the stock market works. We know that that's how money works now. But like to actually see it, to see, my father will not get into Bitcoin. Like I've told him, oh, it's this spectacular investment. You've got money to lose. Like, go for it. And he's like, no, it's just not. Like the older I get, the more conservative I get with my investment. And like now we're at this point where, I'm not really sure. Things seem to have flipped, that there's been an inversion where all of the strategies that my parents offer to me seem like the high risk investment. Like everything that seemed stable a generation ago is now like, you kind of have to be deluding yourself to believe it. Like you have to be future shocked enough to want to go back to, like you talk about this with your relationship with Wendell Berry. And this came to me, I was reading The American Replacement of Nature last year while I was in Portugal on my first trip to Europe. And this thing that you said about the pastoral versus the mystic and like wanting to settle down and put up a fence and tend a small piece of land, it's a very understandable human desire. But then for the mystic, for the person whose sole role it is, the role of their soul, not their exclusive role, to be out into the world, and in that sense of, like I said, like the Jewish wandering, that God appears as the moving whirlwind. And that, this is like very alive for me and for so many people I know right now, the sense of like, are we a generation of mystics? Like it feels like, for those that are sensitive to this very narrowly prescribed Renaissance, this early stage of it, that the better we get at answering questions, the better we get at revealing our ignorances. And so even Kevin Kelly says, that we're approaching an age where the answer is almost zero in value and the question is the most important thing. And so that's a point where science and religion sort of approach this asymptote, and you actually have, like you talk about in Thinking Together, you have this effloration of like a more mystical or spiritual science. And the price of that is living in a world where nothing is stable, nothing is guaranteed, where it's suddenly scientific and practical to adopt this like rigorous open scientific process, this like strict adherence that brooks no room, that offers us no opportunity to like slink into the current sort of Church of Science orthodoxy. Like we're stuck in this, in like a class 4 whitewater rapid of history.
Well, the trick of creativity is to turn your disadvantages into advantages and see what is negative that is actually a possibility, releasing you from premature consolidation. If you try to bottle the blue of the sky, you don't understand the atmosphere. So there is a quality that's always reactionary. If you look at the shift in the Renaissance from feudal kingdoms to nation states, what do you have? You have the explosion of pastoral art, in which, Sir Philip Sidney is writing Arcadia, and people are talking about shepherds piping, to nymphs in the woodland, and that's not what's going on. That's the pastoral. And so Wendell Berry, this family farm artifact in the middle of a planetary culture, doesn't understand it at all. He's consolidated, he's crystallized, and he's very much a pastoral vision. But because he's in the Jeffersonian ethos of America, he very effectively can play, American music. Like if somebody like rock would quote folk music, and riff on it, but take it into an electronic medium, and not just be the traditional folk revival of, say, the early 60s, as opposed to, when the counterculture and acid and everything like that came in, and then suddenly music went electronic. There was a whole different kind of thing. So you're always going to have, Wendell Berry's and Bill Thompson's, and part of Lindisfarne was to bring those opposites together. So Wendell was in the room with John Todd or Jim Lovelock talking about, and Wendell was very upset with Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis. It wasn't rooted enough for him, and it scared the shit out of him. So that's just going to happen. But what we've seen now with this Trump thing, just like Nazi Germany with Hitler, is, that individuals can do a lot of damage. They can hold up the progress of time, for a whole generation, and so it took a concerted effort with America joining European civilization, to get rid of, Mussolini. But what happened was we had to create the deep state and the military-industrial complex to do it. And so we become what we hate, and we end up becoming our enemy. And suddenly America, the land of the free and the home of the brave and the victor against Hitler, becomes, ruled by a deep state that nobody knows who's on the committee, and is an industrial military complex whose economy cannot survive without a war. So every generation we must have a war to keep the thing going, And we haven't solved that paradox.
Thanks so much for listening. Hope you enjoyed that. Part 2 will be up in just a few days. Not even going to make you wait a whole week for it. So stay tuned. Subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play, wherever you go for podcasts. And also be sure to check out the rest of the cool shows on MindPod Network, where this show is hosted. Big thanks to Noah Lampert and everyone else there. MindPod Network is a super cool confluence of interesting conversations from people like Zach Leary, Corey Allen, Michael Phillip, Daniele Bolelli. Bunch of real badasses there, if you ask me. Be sure to go to mindpodnetwork.com and check it out. And if you'd like to support this show, patreon.com/Michael Garfield. Thanks again.